I stood at the lectern of Harvard's most prestigious lecture hall, looking down at the attendance roster for my new graduate seminar on advanced economic theory. My eyes stopped on a name that made my heart skip a beat. Sophia Chen. My sister. Well, my former sister from my previous life. She didn't know who I was yet. How could she? In this life, I was Dr. Maya Jiang, 32 years old, the youngest tenured professor in Harvard's economics department. I had a different last name, wore my hair differently, and according to the mirror, the years of starvation and exhaustion from my previous life had been erased, leaving me with the face I should have had if I'd been allowed to sleep, eat, and live like a human being. But I knew exactly who she was. The door opened, and there she was. Designer handbag, perfectly highlighted hair, that same entitled walk she'd had when she was 18 and I was 25, working my third shift of the day to pay for her spring break trip to Cabo. She didn't even glance at me as she took a seat in the third row, pulling out a laptop that probably cost more than I'd earned in a month back then. My hands gripped the edge of the lectern. The old rage tried to surface, but I pushed it down. I'd had 10 years in this new life to prepare for this moment. 10 years since I'd woken up as my 22-year-old self, gasping for air in a hospital bed after what should have been a fatal car accident. A car accident that happened because I'd fallen asleep at the wheel driving home from my third job at 2 a.m. In my first life, I'd died 3 years later at 25. My body simply giving out from exhaustion, malnutrition, and an untreated illness I couldn't afford to have diagnosed. I'd collapsed in the middle of my night shift at the warehouse, surrounded by strangers, utterly alone. My family hadn't even bothered to come to my funeral. They were too busy celebrating Sophia's graduation from her undergraduate program. The program I'd paid for with my blood and bones. But that was my first life. This time would be different. "Good morning," I said, my voice carrying through the lecture hall with the authority I'd earned through a decade of academic achievement. "Welcome to Econ 2750, Advanced Economic Theory and Market Manipulation. I'm Professor Jiang, and this semester, we're going to explore how individuals and institutions exploit systemic vulnerabilities for personal gain." I let my eyes sweep across the room, deliberately skipping over Sophia. "We'll be examining case studies in exploitation, resource extraction, and the long-term consequences of predatory behavior. By the end of this course, you'll understand exactly how abusers operate and how their victims can reclaim power." Several students leaned forward, intrigued. Sophia was scrolling through her phone, barely listening. Of course she wasn't. Why would she? She'd never had to work for anything in her life. Not in this timeline. Not yet. The memories of my first life were crystal clear, preserved in horrifying detail like insects trapped in amber. I was 5 when my parents brought Sophia home from the hospital. They'd tried for years to have another child after me, and when she finally arrived, perfect and pink and screaming, I became invisible. Not immediately, the transition took a few years, but by the time I was 10 and she was 5, the household hierarchy was established. Sophia was the golden child, the miracle baby, the one who would make our family proud. I was the investment that hadn't paid off, the practice child, the one who existed to serve. My mother started small. "Maya, you don't need new school supplies this year. You can make do with last year's notebooks. Sophia needs a new backpack with her favorite cartoon character." I was 10, Sophia was 5, and her backpack cost more than my entire school supply budget. By middle school, the disparity was obvious to everyone. Sophia had a wardrobe full of name-brand clothes. I wore the same 3 outfits in rotation, washed by hand each night because we couldn't waste water on my laundry. Sophia took piano lessons, dance lessons, art lessons. I came home to an empty house and made dinner for the family because my mother was too busy driving Sophia to her activities. "You're the older one," my father would say, not looking up from his newspaper. "You should be more responsible, more independent. Sophia needs more attention because she's younger." But Sophia never stopped needing more attention. When I was 15 and she was 10, she was still the baby who required all the family resources. I got my first job at a local grocery store, bagging groceries after school. My parents took half my paycheck for household expenses. The other half was supposed to be mine, but somehow there was always an emergency that required my money. Sophia needed textbooks. Sophia needed a new winter coat. Sophia needed money for a field trip. I wore my winter coat until the zipper broke completely, then safety pinned it shut. When I was 18 and Sophia was 13, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table. My mother's face was serious. My father's was carefully blank. "Maya, we need to talk about your future," my mother said. My heart had leaped. Finally, we were going to discuss my college applications. I'd worked so hard, maintained a 4.0 GPA despite working 20 hours a week. I had acceptance letters from 3 state universities, including one with a partial scholarship. "We can't afford to send you to college," my father said flatly. "The money we've saved bid is earmarked for Sophia's education. She's exceptional. Her teachers say she could get into an Ivy League school. We can't let this opportunity pass." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "But I got a partial scholarship. I only need help with room and board." "We need you to get a full-time job," my mother interrupted. "Omar, you're an adult now. It's time to contribute to the family. Sophia's education is going to be expensive, and we all need to pitch in." "Pitch in?" My voice came out strangled. "I've been giving you half my paycheck for 3 years." "Don't be dramatic," my father snapped. "You live under our roof, eat our food. It's time you started paying your fair share. Besides, college isn't for everyone. You're a hard worker. That's your strength. Sophia is the intelligent one." The intelligent one. As if my 4.0 GPA meant nothing. As if my acceptance letters were participation trophies. I should have left then. Should have taken my acceptance letter and my partial scholarship and run. But I was 18 and stupid and still believed that if I just tried hard enough, proved myself enough, my parents would finally see me. So I stayed. I got a full-time job at a call center and a part-time job at a restaurant on weekends. I handed over most of my earnings to my parents for Sophia's college fund. I lived in their basement in a room that flooded every time it rained, ate leftovers after everyone else had finished dinner, and watched my sister get everything I'd dreamed of. When Sophia was 17 and applying to colleges, she got into Harvard. My parents threw a party, relatives came over and congratulated them on raising such an exceptional daughter. My mother cried happy tears. My father beamed with pride. I worked a double shift that night and came home to a house full of celebration I wasn't invited to join. Harvard was expensive. Obscenely expensive. Even with financial aid, the gap was enormous. My parents looked at me across that same kitchen table, and I knew what was coming before they said it. "We need you to take on more hours," my mother said. "Sophia's tuition bill came and we're short." "I'm already working 60 hours a week," I said. I was 22 by then, and the years were showing. I'd developed a persistent cough. Dark circles had taken up permanent residence under my eyes, and I'd lost so much weight that my old clothes hung off my frame. "There are night shifts available at the warehouse," my father said. "The pay is good, and you could pick up some rideshare driving during your free time." "What free time?" I asked bitterly. "Don't be selfish," my mother said sharply. "This is your sister's future we're talking about. She's going to be somebody. She's going to make this family proud. The least you can do is help." So I took the night shifts. I drove for rideshare services between jobs. I slept 4 hours a night on average, sometimes less. I stopped seeing the few friends I had because I didn't have time. I stopped having hobbies because I didn't have energy. I existed solely to work and earn and hand that money over to my parents so my sister could have the life I'd dreamed of. Sophia, for her part, treated me like a particularly useful piece of furniture. When she came home for breaks, she'd regale us with stories of her fabulous college life, the parties, the networking events, the internships at prestigious firms. She'd talk about her friends whose parents were CEOs and senators and celebrities. She'd complain about how hard her classes were, how stressed she was, how she needed a vacation. She never once asked how I was doing. When Sophia was a junior at Harvard, 20 years old and thriving, I was 25 and dying. I didn't know it yet, but my body had already begun shutting down. The persistent cough had become pneumonia, which I'd tried to treat with over-the-counter medicine because I couldn't afford a doctor's visit. The exhaustion had become chronic. The weight loss had become dangerous. I was driving home from my warehouse shift at 2 a.m. when I fell asleep at the wheel. The car hit a median, flipped, and I was thrown clear. I should have died instantly. Instead, I died slowly, over the course of 3 days in a hospital room I couldn't afford, attached to machines keeping me alive long enough for my organs to be harvested for donation. My parents visited once. They didn't cry. They complained about the hospital parking fees and argued with the doctor about the bills. Sophia never came at all. She had midterms. The last thing I remembered from my first life was my mother standing beside my hospital bed, signing the paperwork to end life support. She looked irritated, like I was inconveniencing her one final time. "I always knew you'd be more trouble than you were worth," she muttered. Then everything went dark. I woke up in the same hospital, but 3 years earlier. I was 22, I'd just been in the car accident, and the doctor was explaining that I'd been lucky. No major injuries, just some bruising and a concussion. I'd need to stay overnight for observation. My parents arrived looking annoyed rather than concerned. "Well, at least the car is still drivable," my father said. "We can't afford to replace it right now, not with Sophia's tuition due." That's when I knew it was real. I'd been given a second chance. I spent that night lying in the hospital bed thinking. I had memories of 3 more years. 3 years of increasing exploitation, declining health, and eventual death. I knew exactly what would happen if I continued on this path. But more importantly, I knew what I'd missed. In my first life, I'd been so ground down, so exhausted, that I'd never fought back. I'd accepted my role as the family's workhorse because some broken part of me still believed I deserved it. But death had given me clarity. My parents had never loved me. They'd valued me only for my utility. And Sophia? Sophia had built her entire life on my suffering without a single moment of gratitude or guilt. They didn't deserve my sacrifice. They deserved to reap what they'd sown. As I lay in that hospital bed, I made a plan. The first step was getting out. I was released from the hospital the next day. My parents picked me up, still complaining about the parking fees and the fact that I'd wasted an emergency room visit on just a concussion. My mother handed me a shift schedule for the warehouse. I was expected back at work in 2 days. Instead, I packed a bag that night, took the money I'd hidden in my room, not much, but enough, and left. Just walked out the basement door at 3 a.m. and never came back. I'd never done it in my first life because I'd been too afraid, too indoctrinated to believe I owed them something. But death had cured me of that fear. The worst thing that could happen to me had already happened. I'd died alone and unmourned. Everything from here was a bonus. I stayed at a women's shelter for a week while I figured things out. I had 3 years of future knowledge in my head. I knew which stocks would boom, which companies would fail, which cryptocurrencies would explode. But I had no capital to invest and no credentials to leverage. What I had was time and determination. I enrolled in community college using financial aid and student loans, something I'd never done in my first life because I'd been too busy working. I took a full course load while working part-time at the college library, just enough to pay for a tiny apartment and ramen noodles. It wasn't comfortable, but compared to my previous life, it was freedom. I studied economics. In my first life, I'd never had the chance to discover what I was good at or what I enjoyed. But in those long hours at the warehouse, I'd listened to podcasts on economics and finance. They'd been the only thing keeping me awake. I'd found them fascinating, the way complex systems could be broken down and analyzed, the way markets moved based on human behavior and incentives. Now I could actually study it properly. I was good at it, better than good. I was exceptional. The professors noticed. When I explained that I was putting myself through school, had no family support, one of them connected me with additional scholarships and grant opportunities. Another recommended me for a research assistant position that paid enough to quit my library job. I spent every spare moment studying, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because for the first time in my life, I was building something for myself, and every piece of knowledge I gained was mine to keep. I finished my associate degree in a year, maintaining a 4.0 GPA. I transferred to a state university, this time with enough scholarship money that my debt was manageable. I completed my bachelor's in 18 months. Then I applied to graduate programs. I got into Yale for my PhD in economics. Full funding, living stipend, everything. I was 24 when I started my doctorate, the same age I'd been dying in my first life. The next 8 years were a blur of research, publications, and academic achievement. I was driven by more than ambition. I was driven by the ghost of who I'd been, the girl who'd died without ever getting the chance to become herself. Every paper I published was a middle finger to my parents. Every award I won was proof that they'd been wrong about me. Every step up the academic ladder was another step away from that basement bedroom and its flooding floors. By 30, I had my PhD and multiple job offers from prestigious universities. I chose Harvard because I knew that's where Sophia would be completing her graduate degree. I spent 2 years as an assistant professor, publishing prolifically, teaching well-regarded courses, building my reputation. At 32, I was offered tenure, the youngest person in the department's history to receive it. That's when I looked at the list of incoming graduate students for the fall semester and saw her name, Sophia Chen. My baby sister, all grown up at 27, coming to Harvard for her graduate degree in economics. The irony was exquisite. In my first life, she'd completed her undergraduate degree and gotten a job at a consulting firm, something cushy that her Harvard connections had secured for her. She'd been moderately successful, though without me funding her lifestyle, she'd apparently struggled more than expected. She'd returned to graduate school to boost her credentials, and through sheer coincidence, or perhaps karma, she'd ended up in my program, in my department, in my class. The first 2 weeks of the semester, I watched Sophia carefully. She had no idea who I was. Why would she? The older sister she'd barely noticed had died at 25, and I looked nothing like that exhausted, broken girl. I'd filled out to a healthy weight. I wore my hair in a sleek professional style rather than the limp ponytail of my previous life, and I carried myself with the confidence of someone who'd earned their place in the world. Plus, my last name was different. I'd legally changed it when I started my PhD, partly to make a clean break from my past, partly because I'd gotten married briefly and kept the name after the divorce. Another life experience I'd never had the first time around. Sophia, meanwhile, was exactly as I remembered her, entitled, careless, convinced that success was her birthright. She showed up late to classes, spent half the time on her phone, and her assignments were mediocre at best. She was coasting, expecting her Harvard undergraduate degree and family connections to carry her through. What she didn't know was that graduate school, my graduate school, didn't work that way. In our third week, I assigned the first major paper, a 15-page analysis of exploitation in labor markets. Students were required to identify a case study of systemic exploitation and analyze the power dynamics, economic incentives, and long-term outcomes for all parties involved. Sophia submitted her paper 30 minutes before the deadline. I read it that evening in my office, a glass of wine in hand. It was garbage. Superficial analysis, no original thinking, and several sections that were clearly paraphrased from uncited sources. In my first life, I would have been devastated to produce such poor work, but Sophia had never been held to real standards. Our parents had praised everything she did as brilliant, and her undergraduate professors at Harvard had been too impressed by her charm and connections to grade her harshly. I pulled out my red pen and went to work. The next class, I handed back the papers. I'd graded them blind, using student ID numbers instead of names to ensure fairness. Most students received B's or A minuses. A few exceptional papers got straight A's. Sophia's paper received a D+. I watched her face as she looked at the grade. First confusion, then disbelief, then anger. She raised her hand. "Yes, Ms. Chen," I said calmly. "Professor Zhang, I think there's been a mistake with my grade." "I don't make mistakes with grades," I replied. "If you have concerns about the feedback, I'm happy to discuss it during office hours." Her jaw clenched. She wasn't used to being told no. "I've never gotten below a B+ on a paper in my life." "Then this is an excellent learning opportunity." I smiled. "My office hours are Tuesdays and Thursdays from 2 to 4. Please make an appointment if you'd like to discuss how to improve your work for the next assignment." I turned back to the lecture, leaving her fuming in her seat. She showed up at my office hours the next day, designer purse slung over her shoulder, arms crossed defensively. "Professor Zhang, I really think you were too harsh on my paper. I worked really hard on it." I gestured for her to sit. "Ms. Chen, let's be clear about something. This is a graduate-level course at one of the world's premier universities. The standard is excellence, not art. Not effort. Your paper demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the material and a lack of analytical rigor." I pulled out her paper, now covered in my red annotations. "Look here. This entire section is essentially a summary of the textbook with no original analysis. Here, you make a claim about market inefficiencies without providing any supporting evidence. And here, I pointed to a paragraph that had earned the most red ink. You've paraphrased 3 different sources without proper attribution. That borders on academic dishonesty? Her face flushed. I wasn't plagiarizing. I didn't say you were. I said you were careless with your citations, which in an academic context is almost as serious. If you want to succeed in this program, you need to do better. She stared at me, and for a moment I saw something flicker in her eyes. The realization that she couldn't charm or deflect her way out of this. She was being held accountable, perhaps for the first time in her life. What do I need to do? She asked finally, and there was a sullen quality to her voice that I recognized from childhood. It was the tone she'd used when our parents asked her to do basic chores, as if she were being subjected to some great indignity. Read the material, think critically, produce original analysis, come to class prepared, submit work that reflects serious intellectual engagement. I leaned back in my chair. I'm not asking for anything extraordinary, Ms. Chen, just the baseline standard for graduate-level work. She left my office looking like she'd been slapped, and I felt a dark satisfaction bloom in my chest. This was just the beginning. Over the next month, I assigned increasingly challenging work. Papers, presentations, problem sets that required genuine understanding rather than surface-level regurgitation. The strong students in the class rose to the challenge. The mediocre students struggled, but improved with effort. Sophia floundered. Every assignment came back with a C+ or lower. Every class discussion revealed the shallowness of her preparation. Other students began to notice they'd form study groups and deliberately leave her out, frustrated by her unwillingness to contribute meaningfully. I watched her confidence crack. She started coming to office hours regularly, increasingly desperate for help. I gave it to her, patiently explaining concepts, pointing her toward resources, offering detailed feedback. I was scrupulously fair and professional, but I didn't make it easy and I didn't lower my standards. She was learning what it felt like to work hard and still fall short, what it felt like to have someone look at your best effort and say, not good enough, what it felt like to be me in my first life. By midterm, she was failing. I scheduled a mandatory meeting with her to discuss her academic standing. She arrived looking haggard, dark circles under her eyes, though nothing compared to how I'd looked at her age in my first life, working 3 jobs to fund her education. Ms. Chen, I'm concerned about your performance in my class, I said. You're currently failing, and if you don't significantly improve, you'll need to retake this course. It's a required class for your degree program, which means failing would set you back an entire year. She looked like she might cry. I don't understand. I'm trying so hard. I study all the time. I do all the readings. Are you sure? I asked gently. Because your work suggests otherwise. I am. Her voice rose, cracking slightly. I've never had to work this hard for anything in my life, and I'm still failing. There it was, the admission I'd been waiting for. Ms. Chen, can I give you some advice? I kept my voice professional, even kind. Sometimes the skills that got us to one level aren't sufficient for the next level. You may have been able to coast on natural ability and charm in your undergraduate studies, but graduate school requires a different level of dedication and rigor. If you're serious about succeeding here, you need to be honest with yourself about whether you're willing to put in that work. She wiped at her eyes angrily. You think I'm not putting in the work? I think you're putting in more work than you've ever had to before, and it's still not enough because you haven't built the foundation. That's not your fault. Actually, it absolutely was, but I was maintaining my professional veneer, but it is your responsibility to address. How? She asked, and she sounded genuinely lost. How do I fix this? Keep doing what you're doing. Come to office hours. Work with the other students. Read beyond the required material. Think deeply about the concepts instead of trying to memorize your way through. And be patient with yourself. Building genuine expertise takes time. She nodded miserably and left. I poured myself a drink that evening and toasted my reflection. In my first life, I'd spent 3 years breaking my body to give her this opportunity. Now she was squandering it, learning that all the privilege and support in the world couldn't replace actual ability and work ethic. But I wasn't done. Not even close. In December, I signed the final paper, a comprehensive analysis of a real-world exploitation scenario requiring extensive research, data analysis, and theoretical framework application. It was worth 40% of the final grade. Sophia had managed to claw her way up to a D+ average through sheer persistence. This paper was her last chance to pass the class. The day before the paper was due, she came to my office hours looking panicked. "Professor Jiang, I need an extension. I've been working on this paper for weeks, but I'm stuck. I don't think I can finish it by tomorrow." I reviewed her progress notes. I required students to submit regular check-ins throughout the research process. She'd started late, chosen a weak topic, and her preliminary analysis was predictably shallow. "Ms. Chen, I've given multiple extensions to students this semester when they've had genuine emergencies, medical issues, family crises. But I started late and can't finish isn't grounds for an extension. You've had 8 weeks to work on this paper." "Please," she said, and now she was definitely on the verge of tears. "I'll fail if I don't pass this class. It'll ruin everything. My parents will be so disappointed." The mention of our parents made my jaw clench. I forced my expression to remain neutral. "Ms. Chen, I understand you're under pressure, but I have to be fair to all students. Everyone has had the same amount of time to complete this assignment." "Just 1 extra week," she begged. "Please, you don't understand what's at stake for me." Oh, but I did. I understood better than she could possibly imagine. "I'm sorry," I said. "The deadline stands. I suggest you focus on producing the best work you can in the time remaining." She left my office in tears. The papers were due the next day at 5 p.m. At 4:58 p.m., Sophia submitted hers. I could tell even before opening it that it was a rushed job. The file name included Final Revised V6, which suggested panicked last-minute editing. I saved her paper for last, reading all the others first. Poured myself a second glass of wine, then opened her submission. It was exactly what I'd expected. Unfocused, poorly researched. With an analysis so superficial, it barely qualified as graduate-level work. She'd tried to pad the page count with unnecessary quotations and redundant explanations. Several of her sources were Wikipedia articles that she'd tried to disguise by citing the sources Wikipedia cited, without actually reading those sources herself. It was worth maybe a D, and that was being generous. But as I read through it, something caught my eye. A paragraph in the conclusion that was oddly sophisticated compared to the rest of her writing. I ran it through a plagiarism checker. 75% match with an online essay mill. She'd plagiarized. Not the entire paper. She'd been clever enough to only buy a few paragraphs, probably hoping I wouldn't notice. But it was unquestionably plagiarism, and I had the evidence. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding. This was it. This was the moment. In academia, plagiarism was unforgivable. It meant automatic failure of the course, referral to the Academic Integrity Board, possible expulsion from the program. It would destroy her graduate career before it even started. And it was entirely her own doing. I had been scrupulously fair throughout the semester. I'd given her the same standards, the same feedback, the same opportunities as every other student. I'd offered help during office hours, pointed her toward resources, explained concepts patiently. I had done nothing wrong. She'd plagiarized because she was desperate and entitled, convinced that the rules didn't really apply to her, that she'd find a way to slip through like she always had, but not this time. I filled out the academic integrity violation report, attached the evidence, and submitted it to the department head and the university's academic integrity board. Then I wrote her an email. "Ms. Chen, I have reviewed your final paper and identified sections that constitute plagiarism. Per university policy, this matter has been referred to the Academic Integrity Board for formal review. You will receive notice from them regarding the hearing process. Until this matter is resolved, you will receive an incomplete grade in my course." Professor Jiang, I sent it at 11 p.m. on a Friday night, then closed my laptop and slept better than I had in weeks. The academic integrity hearing was scheduled for early January, after the winter break. Sophia would have spent the entire holiday break knowing her academic career was on the line, knowing she'd been caught, knowing there were consequences she couldn't charm her way out of. I spent the break writing papers for publication and preparing for the spring semester. I also did something I hadn't done in this new life. I looked up my parents. They were exactly where I expected them to be. Same house, same jobs, same comfortable middle-class existence funded by years of exploiting their elder daughter. In this timeline, I'd disappeared 3 years ago after my car accident. They'd reported me missing, filed a police report, but hadn't searched very hard. I was legally an adult and there was no evidence of foul play. Eventually, the case went cold. They'd probably assumed I'd run off somewhere. They'd probably been relieved not to have to support me anymore. I wondered if they ever thought about me. Probably not. I'd been a tool to them, nothing more. And tools don't warrant emotional investment. But Sophia would have told them about her failing grade, her academic probation, the plagiarism charge. She would have complained about her cruel, unreasonable professor who wouldn't give her the special treatment she deserved. And they would have been sympathetic. Would have told her it was unfair that she'd been singled out, that the professor clearly had it out for her. They'd never once considered that Sophia might have earned her failures through her own actions. They'd trained her, after all. Trained her to believe that success was her birthright, that other people existed to smooth her path, that rules were suggestions that didn't really apply to special people like her. They'd made her into what she was, and now she'd have to live with the consequences. The hearing took place on a Tuesday afternoon in a conference room in the administration building. Present were myself, Sophia, the department head, 2 members of the Academic Integrity Board, and a student advocate that Sophia had brought along. The board chair, a stern woman in her 60s, laid out the evidence. The matching paragraphs, the essay mill source, the timeline of when Sophia had purchased the content versus when she'd submitted the paper. It was damning. Sophia tried to defend herself, claiming she'd accidentally included the purchased paragraphs when compiling her research notes, that she hadn't meant to plagiarize, that it was an honest mistake. The board members exchanged skeptical glances. Ms. Chen, the chair said, you're aware that intent is not the primary consideration in plagiarism cases. Whether you meant to plagiarize or not, you submitted work that was not your own as if it were. That's the definition of academic dishonesty. But Professor Zhang has been unfair to me all semester, Sophia burst out, her carefully maintained composure cracking. She grades me more harshly than other students. She wouldn't give me an extension when I needed one. She's had it out for me from day one. I remained calm. I'd be happy to provide the board with all of Ms. Chen's assignments and assessments, along with samples from other students, so you can verify that my grading has been consistent and fair. I'd also be happy to provide documentation showing that I denied Ms. Chen's extension request on the same grounds I've denied similar requests from other students, lack of a qualifying emergency. Several students requested and received extensions this semester for medical or family emergencies. Ms. Chen's request was based solely on poor time management. The department head nodded. Professor Zhang's teaching evaluations are consistently excellent, and we've never received complaints about unfair grading before. I'm confident in her professional conduct. Sophia's face crumpled. She'd played her last card and it hadn't worked. The board deliberated for 20 minutes while we waited outside. When they called us back in, their decision was clear. Ms. Chen, we find that you committed plagiarism in violation of the university's academic integrity policy. Your sanctions are as follows. Automatic failure of Econ 2750, a notation of academic dishonesty on your permanent record, and academic probation for the remainder of your time at the university. Any further violations will result in expulsion. Sophia started crying. This will ruin my career. I'll have to retake the class. I'll lose my fellowship. You should have considered those consequences before you plagiarized, the chair said, not unkindly. The hearing is concluded. I walked out of that conference room feeling 10 feet tall. In my first life, I died so she could have her education. In this life, she was destroying her own education through her own choices. Justice wasn't just served, it was seasoned and garnished. But I still wasn't done. The plagiarism and failed course meant Sophia lost her fellowship funding, which covered her tuition and provided a living stipend. Suddenly, she was facing the prospect of paying out of pocket for graduate school at Harvard while retaking a required course. That's when she did what she always did when faced with a problem. She called our parents. I knew this because 3 weeks into the spring semester, I received a phone call from the department head. Maya, I wanted to give you a heads up. Sophia Chen's parents have contacted the dean's office demanding a meeting. They're claiming you've been unfairly targeting their daughter and they want you removed from teaching her when she retakes your course next year. I felt a jolt of electricity run through me. My parents were here, on campus, demanding things, making accusations, trying to manipulate the system to benefit Sophia like they always had. What did the dean say? I asked. He refused to meet with them without a formal complaint, which they haven't filed because they have no grounds, but he wanted me to warn you in case they try to contact you directly. Thank you for letting me know. I hung up and sat very still at my desk. My parents were here. After 3 years of never knowing what happened to their elder daughter, never caring enough to truly search, they were here on campus fighting for their younger daughter's academic career. The symmetry was poetic. I made a decision. I pulled out my personal cell phone and typed a carefully worded email to my department head. Given on the sase, complaints from Ms. Chen's parents and the potential for perceived conflict, I think it's best if another faculty member teaches Econ 2750 when Ms. Chen retakes it. However, I'd like to invite the Chen family to attend our department's annual lecture series this spring. I'm giving a talk on exploitation in family systems that I think they'd find illuminating. The department head approved both requests. I spent the next 6 weeks preparing the lecture of my lifetime. The department's annual lecture series was a big deal. It attracted not just faculty and students, but alumni, industry professionals, and members of the public interested in economic theory. Each talk was recorded and posted online. It was a prestigious platform, and speakers were expected to present groundbreaking research or innovative thinking. I titled my talk, The Economics of Familial Exploitation, Case Studies in Intergenerational Wealth Transfer Through Coercion. I sent personal invitations to select attendees, including Sophia and her parents. The invitation went to Sophia's student email and my parents' address, publicly available through basic internet searches. The subject line read, Special Invitation, Lecture on Family Economic Dynamics. The day of the lecture arrived. The auditorium was packed. My reputation had grown enough that people were interested in what I had to say. I saw Sophia sitting in the back row looking miserable, and there, 3 rows in front of her, were my parents. I recognized them instantly, though they'd aged in the 3 years since I'd seen them last. My mother's hair had more gray, my father had developed a paunch, they looked prosperous and comfortable exactly as I'd expected. They had no idea who I was. I stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the crowd. This was the moment I'd been working toward for 10 years. 10 years of study, achievement, building a life where my voice would be heard and respected. Good evening, Matin, I said. Thank you all for coming. Tonight, I want to talk about a particular form of economic exploitation that's rarely discussed in academic literature but is surprisingly common in practice. The systematic extraction of labor and resources from family members, particularly from daughters, to benefit other family members. I clicked to my first slide. It showed a graph of labor force participation rates by gender and family status. We often discuss exploitation in terms of employers and employees, corporations and workers, but some of the most egregious exploitation happens within families, where legal protections are weakest and social pressures to comply are strongest. I walk them through the economic theory, how rational actors within a family unit might engage in exploitative behavior when there are no effective constraints, how family hierarchies create power imbalances that enable resource extraction, how cultural norms around filial piety and family obligation can be weaponized. Then I move to the case studies. Let me tell you about a specific case I've studied extensively, I said. A family with 2 daughters, born 7 years apart. The older daughter was treated from childhood as less valuable than the younger. While the younger daughter received music lessons, new clothes, and educational opportunities, the older daughter was given the minimum necessary support. I clicked to the next slide, a detailed economic analysis of resource distribution in a 2-child household. When the older daughter turned 18, she was pressured to forego her own education and work full-time to fund her sister's college expenses. Over the next 7 years, she worked multiple jobs simultaneously, sleeping an average of 4 hours per night. Her estimated total contribution to her sister's education was approximately $180,000, not including the opportunity cost of her own foregone education and career development. Somewhere in the audience, I heard a sharp intake of breath. The younger daughter, meanwhile, graduated from an Ivy League institution debt-free and entered a lucrative career. The older daughter died at age 25 from stress-related health complications. She had no savings, no assets, and no family members present at her death. I paused, letting that sink in. From a purely economic standpoint, this was an efficient transfer of resources. The younger daughter's earning potential was enhanced at minimal cost to the family unit. The only cost was the health and life of the older daughter, who had already been classified as the less valuable asset. My voice was clinical, academic, but my hands were trembling slightly as I gripped the podium. This is what we might call optimal exploitation, the complete extraction of value from one family member to benefit others, continued until the exploited member's death. And because it happened within a family structure, it was legal. Because it was framed as helping the family, it was even considered virtuous. I clicked to the next slide, long-term outcomes. But here's what the family didn't account for, the reputational and karmic costs. The younger daughter, raised to believe she was entitled to others' sacrifice, never developed genuine competence or work ethic. She coasted on privilege and connections but lacked substance. When she eventually faced situations requiring real merit, she failed spectacularly. I looked directly at Sophia. Her face had gone pale. The parents, meanwhile, invested everything in the child they deemed more valuable, but that child's success was hollow, built on a foundation of exploitation that colored every achievement. And the child they sacrificed? They lost not just her contribution, but any chance of redemption. They became, in economic terms, morally bankrupt. My mother had turned around in her seat, looking at Sophia with confusion. My father was frowning, starting to sense that something was off about this lecture. Now, I said. Some of you might be wondering about the ethics of presenting such a personal case study. Let me be clear. I have permission to discuss this case. In fact, I have the most authoritative permission possible. I clicked to the final slide. It was a photograph, a hospital ID bracelet with the name Maya Chen, and the date of admission from my first life. I can discuss this case freely because I was the older daughter. I worked 3 jobs to fund my sister's education. I died at 25 from complications related to chronic exhaustion and untreated illness. And through a statistical anomaly, call it chance, call it cosmic justice, I was given a second chance at life. The auditorium erupted in murmurs. People were turning to each other, shocked. In the back row, Sophia had gone white as a sheet, and 3 rows ahead of her, my parents had frozen in their seats. In my second life, I made different choices. I left the exploitative family system. I pursued my own education. I built a career based on merit, and along the way, I had the profound satisfaction of teaching my former sister, who never knew who I was, and watching her fail on her own merits without anyone to exploit for support. My mother had stood up, her hand over her mouth. My father was staring at me, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and horror. The reason I'm sharing this case study is to illustrate a fundamental economic principle. Exploitation carries compounding costs. My parents thought they were making a rational choice, investing in their more promising child. But they didn't account for the full cost-benefit analysis. They lost one daughter permanently and created another daughter so incompetent and entitled that she plagiarized her way into academic probation. I smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. They optimized for the wrong variables, and now they get to live with the consequences. The room was dead silent. In conclusion, I said, my voice steady and professional, when we study economic exploitation, we must consider not just the immediate resource transfer, but the long-term systemic effects. Exploitation doesn't just harm the victim, it corrupts the beneficiary and hollows out the entire system. Thank you for your attention. I'll now take questions. Nobody asked questions. They were all staring at me, then at my parents, then at Sophia. The department head looked like he didn't know whether to be horrified or impressed. My parents had turned fully around now, staring at Sophia, then at me, then at each other. My mother's face was a mask of shock. My father looked like he might be sick. I gathered my notes calmly, as if I'd just delivered a routine academic lecture rather than a public evisceration of my former family. The full paper will be available in the Journal of Economic Behavior next quarter, I added. With names changed, of course. For privacy, I walked off the ton. I walked off stage and out a side door, leaving chaos behind me. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Within an hour, videos of my lecture were circulating on social media. Within a day, it had gone viral. Economic justice blogs picked it up. News outlets started calling the university for comment. My email inbox exploded with interview requests, messages of support, and a few hate messages from people who thought I'd been too harsh. But mostly, people understood. They saw it for what it was. A daughter who'd been exploited, who'd died from that exploitation, who'd been given an impossible second chance and used it to build a life where she could tell her truth on her own terms. The university stood by me. The department head issued a statement supporting my academic freedom and noting that the case study was a legitimate contribution to economic literature. My colleagues, who'd already respected my work, now looked at me with something closer to awe. Sophia withdrew from the program 2 days later. Just disappeared, presumably to lick her wounds somewhere far away from campus. I heard through academic gossip that she'd moved back home with our parents. Our parents. They tried to contact me once, a week after the lecture. My mother sent an email to my university address. "Maya, we need to talk. Please call us." I deleted it without responding. They had nothing to say that I needed to hear. They'd had 25 years to see me as a person worth their love and support. They'd chosen not to. They didn't get to revise that history now. A month later, I got a message from a lawyer representing my parents. They were threatening to sue me for defamation and emotional distress. I forwarded it to the university's legal team, who responded with a lengthy letter explaining that truth is an absolute defense against defamation, that case studies are protected academic speech, and that my parents should be very careful about pursuing legal action that would require them to prove in court that they hadn't exploited their elder daughter. I never heard from the lawyer again. The spring semester ended. Summer arrived. I spent it writing, not just academic papers, but a memoir. I'd been approached by 3 literary agents after the lecture went viral, and I'd chosen one who understood that this wasn't just a story about family dysfunction. It was about class, gender, exploitation, and the economic structures that enable abuse. The book sold in a preempt to a major publisher for a high 6-figure advance, more money than I'd earned in 3 years of killing myself in my first life. I titled it The Unfair Advantage: How I Died, Came Back, and Became My Sister's Professor. It was scheduled for publication the following spring. But before that, I had one more semester to teach. And this time, I was teaching a new course I'd designed, Economic Justice and Accountability. The course filled up in minutes, partly because of my now notorious reputation, partly because students were genuinely interested in the topic. I structured it around case studies of exploitation and accountability, not just my own story, but workers' rights movements, consumer protection, environmental justice, and systems of restitution. The goal wasn't revenge. I'd had my revenge. The goal was education, helping the next generation understand how exploitation works and how to build systems that prevent it. On the first day of class, I looked out at a lecture hall full of eager, engaged students who'd chosen to be there. "Welcome," I said, "to Economic Justice and Accountability. This semester, we're going to study how systems of power can be challenged, how victims can become agents of change, and how accountability functions in various contexts. We'll discuss real cases, including some of my own experiences, and by the end, you'll understand that justice isn't about revenge. It's about restructuring systems so that exploitation becomes unsustainable." One student raised her hand. "Professor Zhang, is it true you worked 3 jobs to pay for your sister's tuition?" "In my first life, yes," I said. I worked myself to death, literally, because I'd been conditioned to believe that my value came from my utility to others. In my second life, I made different choices, and that's what this course is ultimately about. Understanding that we always have choices, even when systems try to convince us we don't. The students leaned forward, engaged. These were people who deal with exploitation in their own lives, as workers, as consumers, as members of families and communities. They needed to understand how power works so they could challenge it. I taught them everything I'd learned across 2 lifetimes. By December, my life had reached a stability I'd never imagined possible. My book was in final edits. My academic career was flourishing. I'd been invited to speak at conferences, to consult on policy initiatives, to contribute to important conversations about economic justice. My courses were waitlisted. My research was cited. I'd also started dating again, a law professor at the university who specialized in labor rights. She understood my story, respected my work, and treated me like an equal partner rather than a resource to be exploited. We took things slowly, learning to trust, building something genuine. I'd made friends, real friends, who liked me for who I was rather than what I could provide. I'd built a life. And then, one evening in early December, I received an unexpected package. It was from Sophia. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Part of me wanted to throw it away unopened, but curiosity won out. Inside was a handwritten letter. Maya, I don't know if you'll read this. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. But I need to try to say some things, even if you don't want to hear them. I've spent the last 6 months thinking about everything you said in that lecture. About how I was raised, about what happened to you, about my own failures. I've been in therapy. I'm working a regular job for the first time in my life. Nothing prestigious, just retail. I'm trying to understand how things went so wrong. The truth is, I didn't know. I mean, I knew you worked a lot, but I didn't know how much. I didn't know you were dying. Mom and Dad always said you were fine, that you were happy to help, that you were independent and didn't need anything. I was young and stupid and selfish, and I never questioned it. I'm not making excuses. I should have noticed. I should have cared. I should have asked where the money for my tuition was coming from and whether it was fair. But I didn't, because it never occurred to me that I wasn't entitled to everything I was given. You were right about everything you said. I coasted. I never developed real skills or work ethic because I never had to. And when I finally faced real challenges, I folded. I cheated. I failed. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything from you. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying to do better. I'm paying back Mom and Dad for my education costs, all of it, even though they say I don't have to. It'll take me years, probably decades, but it feels important. Like I'm finally paying a debt that should never have existed in the first place. I'm sorry doesn't feel like enough. Nothing feels like enough. But I am sorry for not seeing you, for not questioning, for taking everything you gave and never once saying thank you. I hope you're happy in your new life. You deserve it more than anyone I know. Sophia, I read the letter 3 times, waiting to feel something. Anger, satisfaction, vindication. But all I felt was a deep, weary sadness. She was sorry. Fine. Good, even. But sorry didn't undo anything. Sorry didn't give me back those years in my first life. Sorry didn't erase the memory of dying alone in a hospital room while she took her midterms. Sorry was too little, too late, and too self-serving. I put the letter in my desk drawer and went back to grading papers. Christmas break came. I flew to California to spend the holidays with my girlfriend's family. Warm, chaotic, loving people who'd welcomed me instantly. I exchanged gifts, ate too much food, played board games, and felt more at home than I ever had in my parents' house. On Christmas Eve, I received a text from an unknown number. "This is your mother. We'd like to talk to you. Please call when you can." I blocked the number and went back to my girlfriend's family's white elephant exchange. On New Year's Eve, I stood on a balcony overlooking the city, champagne in hand, surrounded by friends and colleagues. The countdown started. At midnight, fireworks exploded across the skyline. My girlfriend kissed me. "Happy New Year," she said. "What are you wishing for?" I thought about it. In my first life, I would have wished for my parents to love me, for Sophia to appreciate me, for someone to see my worth. I would have wished for relief from the exhausting grind of survival. But in this life, I already had everything I'd never dared to dream of. I had a career I was proud of. I had people who loved me. I had a voice that was heard. I had justice. "I'm not wishing for anything," I said. "I'm just grateful for what I have." And I was. Grateful for the second chance. Grateful for every choice I'd made differently. Grateful for the ability to stand here, successful and whole, while the family that had tried to break me lived with the consequences of their actions. That was enough. More than enough. My book came out in March to immediate bestseller status. The publicity tour was exhausting but exhilarating. Interview after interview, where I got to tell my story, to explain the economics of familial exploitation, to help other people recognize and resist similar dynamics in their own lives. I heard from hundreds of readers who'd experienced similar exploitation. Daughters who'd funded their brothers' educations. Sons who'd given up their dreams to support aging parents who'd never supported them. People who'd been conditioned to believe their value came from their utility, who'd worked themselves to exhaustion for families that took and never gave back. They thanked me for telling my story. They said it helped them feel less alone. They said it gave them permission to walk away from exploitative situations. That was worth more than any amount of revenge. The university threw me a party to celebrate the book's success. My colleagues, my students, my friends, everyone who'd supported me was there. The department head gave a toast. To Professor Zhang, he said, who turned personal tragedy into academic insight, who taught us all about the economics of justice, and who proved that the best revenge is living well. Everyone raised their glasses. I looked around the room at the life I'd built, the career, the relationships, the respect. Everything I'd been denied in my first life, I'd created in my second. Sophia had sent a congratulatory text when the book came out. I hadn't responded. My parents had tried to call again. I'd blocked them. Again. They'd sent a letter to my publisher asking for a meeting. My agent had replied that I wasn't interested in reconciliation. Some wounds don't heal. Some betrayals don't deserve forgiveness. And that was okay. I didn't need closure with them. I needed what I had. A life built on my own terms, success earned through my own merit, and peace that came from knowing I'd taken every disadvantage they'd tried to saddle me with and turned it into strength. 5 years later, I was 42 years old, a full professor, and the director of our department's Center for Economic Justice. My research program was internationally recognized. My teaching awards filled a shelf in my office. My second book, a more academic text on exploitation economics, was required reading in graduate programs around the world. I'd married my girlfriend in a small ceremony surrounded by chosen family. We'd bought a house together, adopted 2 rescue dogs, built a life full of warmth and laughter. I occasionally heard news about my former family through academic gossip channels and social media. Sophia was working in accounting at a mid-level firm, living a quiet life. She'd apparently stayed in therapy and joined support groups for adult children of narcissistic parents. Good for her, I supposed. It wasn't enough, but it was something. My parents had retired. They'd apparently been investigated by financial authorities after my book came out. Several readers had reported their treatment of me to state social services and financial regulators. Nothing had come of it legally, since I'd been an adult during most of the exploitation, but the scrutiny had damaged my father's reputation in their community. They'd moved to a smaller house in a different state, away from people who knew their story. I felt nothing when I heard this, not satisfaction, not pity, nothing. They were strangers to me now, people I'd once known in a life that felt increasingly distant. What mattered was the present, the students I was mentoring who came from difficult backgrounds, who I could help navigate academia's challenges, the research that was changing how economists thought about intrafamily resource distribution, the policy recommendations my center developed that were being implemented to protect vulnerable family members from exploitation. I was using my second chance not just for personal success, but to make sure fewer people suffered what I'd suffered. One afternoon, I received an email from a first-year graduate student in my department, a young woman from a working-class background who'd put herself through school while supporting her family. Professor Zhang, I just wanted to thank you for your book. I read it last summer and it changed my life. I'd been planning to drop out of graduate school because my family needed me to get a job and send money home. But your story helped me understand that I wasn't selfish for pursuing my own dreams, that I had a right to build my own life. I stayed in school, I got a research fellowship, I'm on track to graduate in 3 years, and I'm teaching my family that love doesn't mean sacrifice. It means supporting each other's growth. Thank you for showing me what was possible. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for thriving. Jessica Torres. I printed that email and pinned it to my bulletin board next to dozens of others like it. This was what mattered. Not revenge on people who'd never really mattered, but building something that outlasted the pain, that transformed suffering into wisdom that could help others. I thought about my first life sometimes, the exhaustion, the exploitation, the slow death from overwork. But I didn't dwell on it. That girl had died so I could live, and I was determined to make that sacrifice mean something. I'd been given an unfair advantage, a second chance that most people never got. I could have used it purely for personal revenge. And for a while, I had. Watching Sophia fail, exposing my parents publicly, those had been satisfying in the moment. But the real victory wasn't their downfall, it was my rise. It was every paper I published, every student I mentored, every person who read my story and found the courage to change their own. That evening, I came home to my wife, my dogs, my comfortable house filled with books and art and life. We cooked dinner together, talked about our days, made plans for the weekend. Simple domestic contentment that I'd never imagined possible in my first life. As I fell asleep that night, I thought about the girl I'd been, working 3 jobs, dying slowly, believing she had no value beyond her utility to others. I thought about how far I'd come, how much I'd changed, how completely I'd rewritten my story, and I thought about the title that had started it all. They made me work 3 jobs for her tuition. In the end, that had been their mistake. They'd taken everything from me, used me up, thrown me away. They'd thought they were being smart, optimizing their family's resources by exploiting the daughter they deemed less valuable. But they'd miscalculated. They'd created their own enemy. They'd given me the motivation, the anger, the absolute determination to become someone they could never touch, never exploit, never diminish again. After Rebirth, I became her professor. But more importantly, I became myself, whole, successful, powerful in ways they'd never imagined possible. I became everything they'd tried to prevent me from being, and that was the best revenge of all.